So they helped in proposing who could be guest speakers today. And Dr. Arismendi organized. So we are very, very thankful for everything. And without further okay, thank you. I'm going to go get the students upstairs and I'll be right back.
Okay, thank you very much, Patty. Well, you are familiar with this type of sessions. Melanie will be presenting for about 40 minutes. And then we have the chance to ask conversation that you may have based on what she presented. But before starting, I would like to say a little bit more about Melanie. Melanie Gonzalez is an associate professor of ESL, English Second Language and Literacy, in both the English and Secondary and Higher Education Department at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, USA. She also serves as the graduate chairperson for the Secondary and Higher Education Department and a Salem State Scientific Fellow for Global Engagement. She's currently with the Departamento de Lenguas de la Universidad de Guanajuato, serving as a Fulbright Garcia Scholar in teaching a foreign language. My sincere appreciation to Dr. Melanie for being here, sharing some knowledge with us. So please welcome to Dr. Melanie and please go ahead.
I just want to say I am really honored to be with you here today. I see some familiar faces in the audience, and today I am going to share with you a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I've been in the field of English language teaching for about 16 years now, and I have specialized in the intersection between vocabulary and writing. So I really appreciate your time today, so that I can share with you something that I'm really passionate about. I'm also going to ask for a little bit of participation during my talk, so I hope that you will provide some answers and answer some questions that I have for you to contribute to the talk. So just an overview of what we'll be talking about today. So first we'll start out with kind of the nature of vocabulary, and then why, and get into the nature of academic writing, and then kind of bring it all together on why vocabulary is really important and central to academic writing in a new or additional language. So we'll talk a little bit about defining what is a vocabulary or what is a word. We'll talk about kind of how do we know that we know a word and its meaning, and then how that informs academic writing. How many words do we actually need to know to write well for academic purposes? And we'll talk a little bit then at the end about some activity ideas, best practices, and recommendations for you should you teach academic writing. So because I focus on vocabulary, there are going to be some words that we use in this presentation. This is a list of just some of them. I will make sure that you know what each of these words mean as we talk about them. Some may look familiar to you, and some may be new to you in this presentation. All right, so our first task that I'm going to ask you to participate in, we're going to play a little game. And so what I'm going to do is together, we're going to write a text, okay? So what I'm going to do is give some of you a number, and the number that I give you is going to be either 1, 2, 3, all the way down to 11. And whatever your number is, I want you to come up with one word that fits that part of speech or that guideline that I give you, okay? Got it? All right, so we'll start out here. So Ruth, I'm gonna give you 1. Ilse, you can be 2. I'm gonna come over here to Gustavo. Can you be number 3? And number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. Okay, you got your number? All right, I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Come up with your word for that guideline, and then we'll write a text together. Okay, so 30 seconds. Okay, so number one, who had number one wants to tell me a person's name? Ruth. ¿Cómo se escribe?
Okay, Steve.
Steve? Steve. Muchísimas gracias. Who had two? Is it handsome? Okay. Oops. Steve, we want handsome. All right, number three. Who had three? Gustavo.
Teacher.
Okay. Teacher. Number four. Who in the audience had a four? I'm sorry? Can you spell it for me? Maz, yep. Okay. Number five. Who had five? I'm sorry? Anxiety, yes. We're gonna say anxious. Okay, number six. Who had six? Ah. Can you say again?
Again.
Nice. Did I write it correctly? And number seven. Who had a seven? Okay. Flower. Number eight. 13. Number nine. Teacher. Ooh, we stayed with our same word here. Good job. Cohesion. Number 10. Yes. Women. All right. And number 11. Mangracio. I will try to spell P con P.
D.
Perfect. Okay, so we have our word. This is, does anyone know what kind of writing this is? It's academic writing. It's a cover letter, right? For a job. You would write a cover letter for a job. So this is actually grammatically correct, but why does it sound kind of funny? If we read it out loud, dear Steve, it is with handsome enthusiasm that I apply for the teacher position at Mazda. Are there teachers at Mazda? Maybe corporate training, right? I'm very anxious and becoming part of your gang of rovers. I'm detail-oriented and a dependable flower. I also have 13 years of experience as a teacher, which greatly informs the work I can do for you. I look forward to discussing my women with you. Sincerely, Pancracio, right? Okay, so everything is grammatically correct. You gave us the correct parts of speech. You followed the guidelines, but yet something is off. What sounds funny here? The words don't quite make sense for the context, right? So this is the kind of idea that we have with academic writing, that actually there's a lot of focus on grammar in academic writing. However, when it comes to actually communicating ideas and messages clearly and accurately, then that means actually vocabulary tends to rise to more importance than grammar. Grammar can come next. So first we have to start with the words in order to make sure we're fulfilling what we need to with the writing. So that's why we'll talk today about the nature of vocabulary and its relationship to writing. So let's first start with kind of the role of vocabulary plays more generally with language, right? It's really kind of like the Legos of language. You can take those Legos, you can move them around, and you can make different meanings. Sometimes those meanings are accurate and clear. Sometimes they might not be, and you might need to take them apart and put them back together again. So vocabulary really is the foundation of language. You need words in order to put them into grammatical structure, right? Word choice also, when we sit down to write, when we are selecting the words we want to use to communicate our message, they really are more than just the simple exact meanings of the words. They actually can actually inform what kind of grammatical patterns we use. Sometimes they're, especially our really frequent words, We can, depending on the preposition we put after a verb, it can change the meaning completely. So word choice is really understanding more about what is the idea I want to communicate. Do I want to use an everyday word? Do I want to use a fancy word to impress my reader? Things like that. And that leads us into actually this idea that meaning is actually socially constructed, meaning that when we're picking words, we're thinking of somebody in our mind. Do you have parents or friends or family or professors that tell you, oh, don't use that word. I don't like it. It's malsonante or something like that, right? We know there's certain rules that with whom we can use certain words with and with whom we should not use certain words with. So what that means is like the meaning of our words that we choose for our texts and for what we use in academic context, there's an audience. It's socially constructed on what is appropriate and okay, and what maybe we might want to avoid in order to communicate accurately with our audience. So that takes us to what exactly is a vocabulary word. A lot of times when we think of a vocabulary word, we think of letters with white space on either side, right? Those are those single words like elephant or presentation or hypothesis, right? However, what drives people really crazy about English is that we have actually words that are more than just single words. We actually have 4 other types. We have set phrases, variable phrases, phrasal verbs, which who loves phrasal verbs in here, right? And then lastly, idioms. So the set phrases, the differences between these is that set phrases really are words that are more than one word that stick together. And when you put those words together, they change the meaning of the individual words in that phrase. So an example of this would be like in other words, or back and forth, or to arrive at a conclusion, right? The reason why these are set phrases is we cannot move those words around and keep the same meaning. We can't say other in words, doesn't sound right. That's just not how it's put together. Back and forth, a fluent user of English would be like, oh, we can't go forth, we can't go back before we go forth, so we can't change those around. Same thing with to arrive at a conclusion. If you were to take one of those words out, you would lose the meaning. A variable phrase, though, is actually one that it's the same idea, more than one word sticks together to make a new word. However, you can change the parts of that phrase a little bit to keep the meaning. So it has come to blank attention, that, right? What might be a word we put in that blank? It come to my attention, it's come to our attention. By the way, is that a good thing when someone says that? Or do you get nervous when you hear? You get nervous, right? It come to my attention that you've been late to class several times, right? You know, the professor is probably going to tell you, start coming earlier to class, right? Then if we go to phrasal verbs, we have those lovely verbs that take a preposition, like put away, come up with, take away. You could make 18 different phrasal verbs just with the verb take by changing that preposition after it, and the meanings completely change. Lastly, we have idioms that are culturally based and depend on the variety of language that you use. So in American English, we have some idioms like get with the program, to have a case of the Mondays. Do you know the case of the Mondays? What do you think the case of the Mondays might mean for this idiom? In the US, Monday is usually the start of a work week or the start of a school week. And to have a case of the Mondays means, oh, I feel a little tired. I just had a weekend where I got to do what I wanted. It's taking me a little bit slower to get into the rhythm of work or school, et cetera, like that. If you're a teacher, your students might have case of the Mondays sometimes, right? Good. So these are the types of vocabulary words, and why this is important to writing is because in speaking, we can, change around some of these phrases that you can still communicate clearly. However, in academic writing, when you're turning in something for a grade, or maybe your language proficiency is being assessed on that task, sometimes this becomes a little bit of an issue for the reader. So the types of the words, when we're thinking about teaching vocabulary for writing purposes, it's important to know that we need to teach vocabulary beyond just single words. Talk about the words that usually come with that word. Okay. So then what does it mean to actually know a word and how to use it? We actually have about 5 parts of word knowledge that are important to writing. First, we need to know if a word is what's called polysemous, or a word's polysemy. And this is a big fancy word for multiple meanings, meaning that, so an example like table, what's the first thing you think of when you say the word table? Chair, or what's the meaning you see? Right, something that you eat at or you put a computer on. What's another meaning of table? There's another way we can use it. Chart? Like a chart, yeah. So like you have an academic presentation, might be where you have the grids and the lines, right? In government, you can say, I'm going to table a bill, meaning that the bill is having some discussion. We're gonna put pause on it, we'll come back to it later. So this is polysemy. It's when a word has multiple meanings. So it gets complicated, even with high frequency words like table, depending on the academic setting, the meaning can shift, right? Versus math, versus academics, etc. We then have a word's denotation versus connotation. And a denotation is, if you were to look it up in the dictionary, this would be the first definition you would see. And a connotation is more the cultural meaning of that word. So an example of this would be slim versus skinny. In American English, we have actually a positive meaning and a negative meaning. So the dictionary definition says it's the same thing, someone who's relatively thin, right? However, culturally, if you were to say someone was slim, is that positive or negative? It's a more positive connotation. Skinny, though, has a more negative connotation, right? That kitten that looks really skinny. It means, ooh, that kitten, you may need to give it some more food, get it to the veterinarian's office. So we see the difference between denotation and connotation. Both those words mean the same, they're synonyms. However, depending culturally, it has a different meaning. The frequency of the usage is really important as well. So how often are we likely to see this word in its use? So we have an example of like blue versus azure. Again, these are both synonyms for the color blue. However, in everyday conversation, which word are we going to use to say, oh, I really like your blank sweater? What word would we use? Blue. If you said, I really like your azure sweater, what do you think the person's gonna look at you like? They'd be like, wow, I've never heard that word. That sounds odd, right? However, azure might be used in a travel brochure because it's really trying to explain a very specific type of blue. Azure is usually used with water, oceans, things like that. So frequency is important because you know how often you're likely to encounter that word. As English language teachers, we're probably going to teach blue first, right? Before we teach azure. So maybe later as they grow proficiency, we'll teach the word azure. The next one is usage, and this is again this is related to idioms and cultural patterns. An example of this would be synonyms for to die, right? What are some words for die that we know? Passed away. Anything else? I'm sorry? Gone, yeah. Sorry for your loss, things like that, right? In the United States, we have a phrase called kicked the bucket. And one time when my grandmother died, one of my students was writing a card and he understood that we shouldn't say, that he didn't want to say, I'm so sorry your grandma died. He thought that was a little too strong to say when I was experiencing the loss. So he went online and he said, I'm so sorry your grandma kicked the bucket. Now you know, culturally, right? That's a little odd to say. I was an ESL teacher, so I knew exactly what happened, and I did not take offense. But these are the kinds of things that we can see with usage. Like, how likely is someone going to understand your intended message behind the word choice that you use? And then lastly, collocation means the words that are likely to co-occur or to happen or to stick together with that word. So for example, if I have the word commit, what's the first word you think of that happens right after commit? To commit to, right? To commit to a, right? So we know that the verb commit likely has something that's going to follow it. Now we can actually bring in usage too with commit. If we say to commit a, is that positive or negative that's coming after that? Negative, right? Because you say to commit a crime, to commit fraud, things like that, right? But to commit to suddenly becomes positive, right? To commit to a person, to commit to a project. So we can see how collocation, when it comes to certain vocabulary words, are also really critically important, especially when it comes to writing and word choice. All right, so let's get into a little bit the lexical system and start to talk how this applies more clearly to writing. Vocabulary, when we teach vocabulary to our students, and if we look at second language acquisition research, it says that vocabulary actually progresses in a pretty systematic way. We usually start to acquire high frequency terms more easily because we encounter them so often in the English language. Your English language textbooks are going to do the high frequency words first before they start getting into more low frequency terms like azure, right? Everyday writing does tend to include more high frequency and surprisingly some low frequency terms, and I'll explain why. So if we look here at this everyday writing, this is a postcard, and this is about my home state of Massachusetts. It's a postcard. You can see here that the blue is what's considered high frequency terms. This makes up about 80% of the English language that we use every day. The green and the red starts to get into the mid frequency and the low frequency realms of language. So everyday writing is usually going to follow the same pattern. About 80% of the words we use is going to come from that high frequency, and it may pull some low frequency terms because things like proper nouns like Massachusetts, Ava, which is a name, Boston, those are going to be considered low frequency because they're proper nouns. They may not occur all too often. So that's an example of everyday writing. But let's look how it changes when we get to academic writing. When we get to academic writing, we can see that more of the mid-frequency and low-frequency terms start to come into the writing. So you can see here that it's less than 80% is high-frequency terms, and we actually have approaching 20% are mid-frequency and low-frequency terms. Now, surprisingly for students, a lot of times those low frequency words are a little easier to understand because they're proper nouns or really rarely occurring words. It's these high frequency terms actually in academic writing that starts to present challenges because you start to see how words start to stick together. Things like, in other words, in conclusion and summary of, those are where our high frequency terms start to cause writers some confusion. So let's get into what's considered the right or correct words in academic language. In writing, it's very complex because we want to have our learners understand that there's an audience. And I remember I said back to the beginning, meaning is socially constructed. So this idea of what is the right words actually depends on who you're writing for, the type of writing that you're doing, and kind of the power dynamics that are involved in communicating with this audience, right? So it depends on who that person is. A professor traditionally has a lot of power. They're grading writing. A teacher has some power there because they're doing some sort of assessment and feedback on the writing. So there's going to be some expectations that the student writer needs to have to meet their expectations around what is considered correct or not. It shifts depending on what they're expecting for the task. So you know how when you sit down to get an academic writing, there's a prompt. Somebody gives you a question and what to respond to. That is critically important for understanding what is the situation, who's the audience, and what is kind of the type of writing I have to do. Is it going to be a postcard, or is it going to be more like a summary of an academic concept that we're trying to communicate our understanding about? What this leads us to know is that vocabulary, kind of back to our game that we played, vocabulary and grammar are actually quite connected. So once we have the words, we then have to start thinking about how do we put those words in a way that meets our audience's expectations. And this is a fancy low frequency term called lexicogrammar. And I'll show you what I mean by lexicogrammar. So lexicogrammar means that you start with vocabulary and then you decide what order you're going to put those words in. What are the words that are going to, how do you structure them? What kinds of patterns do you need to replicate? So you start with the words, the phrases, and the meanings, and then we go over to deciding, should we put an ED on the end of that word? Do we need to make it plural with an S? What kind of structure are they going to be in? And what this means is that a lot of words that we have can be very semantically strong, meaning that the word we say has one meaning and it's not going to change, versus words like our phrasal verbs, like take, where they have grammatical functions in a sentence and they can change their meanings depending where you put them in. And I'll give you some examples to make this a little bit more concrete. So in lexicogrammar, on this side, we have really words that have strong meanings. If we say this word, we know exactly what we're talking about, right? You look it up in a dictionary and it's usually going to have one or two definitions and it's not going to change. So words like biomes, Guanajuato, proper noun, aperture, those are really semantically strong, but they're usually always going to be nouns and we know how to use them well in a sentence. However, if we get towards the middle, we have some of those mid-frequency words, those words with multiple meanings. Those are kind of in between being very semantically strong. But if we go over here to the other side, words like a, the, one, of, up, on, those words are grammatically strong, but usually the meaning is a little less weak because it needs some other word to go with those to make it more semantically strong. So this is lexicogrammar. So even though the words here on this side of the spectrum, even though these are really high frequency terms, they tend to be the ones that writers have trouble with because depending on where you put them in a sentence, or if you forget to put them in a sentence, it can alter the message, it can change the meaning. So even though these are high frequency terms and we may think our student writers, oh, they've already learned these words. They learned that in level 1 of English class. When they get to level 5 and they're writing for academic purposes, these are the words that tend to cause some trouble for our students. So it means when we're teaching vocabulary for writing purposes, do not assume that high frequency terms are already learned, that they're already known, and that everyone knows what to do with them. They still need practice with these semantically weak, grammatically strong words. All right, so that brings us to kind of some academic writing. So I'm going to have another little participation for you again. So I'm going to give you a little timed writing assignment. Who loves timed writing? This is sometimes common for academic purposes. So I'm going to give you a 5-minute writing activity. I just explained to you a very complex academic concept called lexicogrammar. If your birthday is in the months of January to June, I want you to write 3 to 5 sentences in your first or strongest language, the language you feel most comfortable in. And I want you to define lexicogrammar for me, okay? If your birthday is in July to December, I want you to write 3 or 5 sentences in your second language or the language that you also have learned after your first, okay? So just really quick, if you have a notes app in your phone or if you have a piece of paper, I'm going to actually time you and give you 5 minutes to do this activity. All right. Your topic again is going to be defining lexicogrammar. I'm going to give you a second to get your notes app open. Ready for me to start the timer? Yes? All right, 5 minutes on the clock and go. So those of you who did their writing in their first language, raise your hand. Okay. How many of you did it in your second language? Okay, we have more birthdays than those types. All right, so those of you who wrote in your first language, how did you choose your words to define lexicogrammar? And how did you feel as you wrote? Were you able to accomplish the task? Those of you, no? No, how many sentences did you get in your first language?
I only gave two because I didn't know what else to write.
It was a new concept, right? This academic concept that you just learned about and you're asked to kind of write really quickly in time, right? How did you feel as you were writing the words? Did it feel relatively easy to kind of come up with some of the words to start defining them? No. Yes.
Something that I noticed is that, for example, I was writing in Spanish,
Uh-huh.
but then I realized that it's supposed to be academic writing, so I changed the words that I was using.
Aha. So you said to yourself, oh, this is academic. I need to do something different to the words. Nice. For those of you who wrote in your second language, how did you feel? Did you accomplish the task of 3 to 5 sentences? Yes. Okay. No, I see a lot of head shakes. 5 minutes wasn't a lot of time. How did you choose your words? Did it flow naturally? Uh-huh.
Started writing before. I started actually with a short sentence, and I ended up with like a sentence of like two.
Great. Yeah, so basically you realized within one language there were 2 different varieties. You had more simple, social, everyday terms, and then you said, oh, wait a minute, academic, I need to do something different to my vocabulary. Good. If I collected and assessed your small paragraphs, how confident would you be that you accomplished the task to my expectations? Ruth, why are you shaking your head? No? You think I'd be a tough grader and say you didn't get it right?
No, I just know that I am a bad writer.
So you would not feel confident that you accomplished the task, right? So basically, when we're thinking about academic writing, these are all in play. You realize you start to write and you say, wait a minute, what vocabulary should I be using? Am I feeling confident that I know the concept? Am I showing my learning, my understanding of my ideas? You're always thinking, usually in academic writing, about someone looking at that writing and perhaps some judgments happening, which causes you to feel a little bit more stressed, right? I'm obviously not going to collect your papers, but I want you to use this experience to kind of think about when we're teaching academic writing in an additional language, it's actually quite multilingual, whether you're using varieties within one language, or maybe if you are multilingual with one or more named languages, you might be using Spanish and English to help you accomplish that task. So for example, like when I'm writing in Spanish, I notice I'm thinking a lot in English, and then I'm saying, wait a minute, I shouldn't be thinking in English. How can I say this in Spanish? It's not translating quite right. So basically, there's some similarities and differences that can happen when we're trying to select the words to write to communicate the ideas clearly. So the similarities across all languages is that we usually know there's a process to plan, to write, to revise, right? Whether you write it in everyday language first and then you convert it to academic language, whether you write it in Spanish first and then put it into English. So we know there's some planning, writing, and revising. We know we usually brainstorm, we reread what we wrote, we edit what we wrote, and we know that there's some sort of expectations based on whoever the reader is for our writing. But some of the differences is that research has shown is that students who are writing in a new or an additional language, they might do less planning because it takes a little bit longer to go between multiple languages and multiple varieties. It doesn't matter what language the teacher says to write in, most people are going to use multiple languages to select the right words and to compose their text. That also is part of the reason why it might be a little bit slower. And also, the reason why I put both expectations for audience on both sides is sometimes culturally how we communicate our ideas and the structure of it differs. So when I was a child growing up, learning to write in English when I was really young, I used to write a lot and tell stories and like have these run-on sentences, which was very much how my family spoke and kind of the structure that they use. But I realized very quickly in the United States, teachers really wanted me to be direct with a topic sentence, 3 detail sentences, and like a conclusion, right? That's not how my brain culturally worked. And so sometimes there can be differences on the audience in terms of like the structure and what they're expecting. But the biggest difference that research has shown in academic writing is that when we write in our first language, we tend to create the ideas and then we find the words to communicate those ideas. However, it's the opposite in a newer language. Usually our ideas might be limited to only the words that we know in that second language, especially if the teacher or the professor is expecting it to be in a certain language. So sometimes students may feel limited by the words and say, oh, I can't say that idea because I don't know how to say that in this context and what would be appropriate. So that's one of the challenges with writing between multiple languages. So how much vocabulary do we actually need to do writing well? Research has shown about that mid-frequency range is very helpful. So getting up to kind of what we call 8,000 to 9,000 word families. And a word family is basically like, if you take the word favor, that's considered the head of the family. And then words like favorite, favored, unfavorable would be part of that family. So usually getting up to about that high frequency to mid frequency range on that pyramid that I showed you. But the number one frustration for student writers is when there's a high number of unknown words or they have partial knowledge of certain words. They're unlikely to use those words they have partial knowledge for, especially because when we write academically, usually someone's doing some sort of evaluation on it. It's considered what's called high stakes writing. It's used often in classrooms for understanding if a student has learned content, or in the case of English language teaching, to see your language proficiency, right, on display for the teacher to know. I'm going to go ahead and skip a little bit. So if we go to what those evaluations might be in academic writing, some of these you might have seen. So here's some examples from TOEFL, IELTS, from Cambridge, the CEFRs. So we see here with vocabulary, it says up at the top here, almost no lexical errors other than those expected from a competent writer under time conditions. They may be forgiving for some misspellings or typos, but pretty much they don't want to see any lexical errors in a high score on a TOEFL. For IELTS, it's the same thing. They talk about lexical resource. So how much vocabulary do you know? What can you draw upon in order to put into your writing? In Cambridge, they say basically no signs of having to restrict what they want to say. That's exactly what we were talking about before, right? Where sometimes our ideas might be limited to the vocabulary we know. So these are some of the ways that student writers are judged in terms of their language based on vocabulary when they write academically. So to show you an example, this is a text that one of my students wrote at my university. I teach a writing class for multilingual students. So here you can see some vocabulary that the student chose to write about his topic. If you look at this and you think back to that criteria on the rubric, are there any words or things you might pick out to give some feedback to the student on? What do you see here in his writing? I'll give this 30 seconds to take a peek at it. So this student passed the TOEFL, so they have high level of vocabulary. What's something you might pick out to give feedback on?
Colorful life.
Colorful life, yeah. Colorful. So maybe it sounds a little different to describe a life as being colorful. Right? Good. So you might pick that out. I'll show you an example. I had other professors do a study to see what kind of feedback they would give. And here you can see some examples. So yep, colorful life was marked as a word choice. They picked out, say, technologies, saying that's a non-count noun, but really that's a vocabulary thing, right? Technology versus technologies. And actually I have to say, I kind of disagree with that because I've heard saying technologies more often now in our digital era that maybe we can make it a count noun. So you can kind of see some of the feedback they give. So like, point about society, more convenient. Can a society be convenient? Going to that usage aspect of word knowledge. So you can kind of see how a teacher might mark up a student's paper based on the academic vocabulary that they chose, right? So that's one example. So let's go to best practices for actually teaching vocabulary, and I'll give you some recommendations for giving some feedback, some better feedback on student writing. So my recommendations are to basically select a variety of words to teach and the word knowledge that is needed to use those words in writing. My next recommendation is to teach. You should do assessment and give feedback on the vocabulary the students use. But I really would say make sure that if you're going to give assessments based on vocabulary, make sure that you have a lot of what we call low stakes writing, where students just get to practice the vocabulary they know. Because again, if you make it high stakes and you're always judging their language, that really makes student writers less confident in their writing. Like Ruth said, you don't like to write too much. So those are the kinds of experiences that can make writing a very stressful experience for our students. So ensuring that they have opportunities to practice with the writing they know. Don't ignore that multiple languages are being used in writing. Allow students to do part of that writing process using whatever language that they have, that they can get those ideas out first and then start to work with the vocabulary. It also means that include joint writing, where students have the opportunity to write collaboratively with others, in addition to doing independent writing. Don't always assign independent writing tasks because, again, that's very lonely, and getting more than just the teacher's feedback is really helpful for vocabulary purposes. And then lastly, even if you're teaching writing, pick some good model texts that you can spend some time analyzing with your students. Those model texts are going to show vocabulary in use. You can point out words that tend to collocate with others, that tend to stick together with those high frequency terms that can be very problematic. So model texts and choosing good model texts in the classroom are really helpful. So research shows that reading is connected to writing. So the better reader you are and knowing how vocabulary is used, the better writer you are. And vice versa, the better writer you are actually makes you a better reader. So model texts are absolutely critical to use in the writing classroom. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give you some activities that you can use. So some of our activities that you can use to help develop those best practices is for using model text. I really recommend doing something called a vocabulary walk, that when you start out with a new reading, you ask students, you pre-teach and pre-select some key words or phrases that you want the students to know. Have them preview, skim and scan that text to find those words and see how they're used in context. In the writing classroom, when you work with model text, doing annotation, marginal notes to kind of write the definitions, how they, the grammatical usage needs for those words, annotation activities are really helpful for using model text too. And then something that's really fun to do, like we were talking about how you might write your text in social or everyday language first and then translate it to academic writing, which is really fun with model text, is to get students to know that for audience and the genre, there's certain structural rules that happen with that text. Have them actually rewrite a text and break those rules. Have them use bad language in order to express academic language. That actually is not so much teaching the vocabulary, but it's teaching students to become better readers and users of text, so that they know when they sit down and see a writing prompt that there's going to be certain expectations they need to follow. And sometimes breaking the rules can help teach you the rules, right? There's actually a book called Twitterature, you know, the app Twitter, which I think now is called X or something. They took famous books and they wrote them in tweet form. So that's an example of breaking the rules. You can start to see how language changes, how your vocabulary changes depending on the genre of the text. My next recommendation is do joint writing activities where you use the power of the class to practice writing. One is called language experience approach, where you as the teacher ask the students to start a paragraph for you. So if I had asked you to say out loud to me, what is lexicogrammar? The teacher actually starts to write. So like one student might say, lexicogrammar is the connection between vocabulary and grammar. The teacher writes it exactly as the students say. If there's mistakes, that's fine. The students dictate the writing together as a class. And then you should have like a paragraph of text. Then after that, you have the class get into small groups. They edit, they change the vocabulary, they make the corrections to it. But the nice thing is you're crowdsourcing the text together. The teacher's the one writing, and then you give the students a chance to clean it up, to make it their own, to fix the text. The other idea too is roundtable writing, which is similar, but let's say you start a piece of paper, like Ruth has a paper, Ilse has another paper, and they start the sentence. You give 1 minute for them to write as much as they can on a topic, and then they pass the paper to the next person. You do this a couple of times, and by the time the person's paper comes back to them, so by the time Ruth's paper has gone through 10 different people, she's got a whole page of text. She may have only written 1 sentence, but she's got other people's language on the paper. The idea then is Ruth then goes and she corrects and she changes the language that's on the page. And then lastly, as the teacher, it's really important to track those words that you chose to teach your students. So have your students keep vocabulary notebooks. You can use a word wall if you actually get to have a dedicated classroom. If you track those words, you can help your students show how they're growing their vocabulary for writing purposes. All right, so basically in summary, my recommendations to you are to vary those types of words, allow for practice using those new words that you pre-taught, do it in groups, do it independently. Sometimes don't even look at the student writing, just give them chances to actually practice with the vocabulary you're teaching. And then really make your students understand that they're writing for someone, an audience. That audience might be real or it might be imagined, but have them understand that there's an audience for their, someone's going to read their writing. And then lastly, make sure to empower students' word choice and defend their choices. So like in that case of my student, we picked out colorful life as sounding a little funny, but actually colorful life, maybe that student really did choose that, right? Talking about having, especially if you look at a cell phone with all the apps, it's very colorful, right? You may be adding color to life. So have students kind of be purposeful about their word choice and defend it when they feel that that's the right word they chose. And then lastly, make sure that we're critically analyzing our own writing evaluation practices. We need to understand our students need feedback on vocabulary. It can be complex to understand all those parts of the word knowledge. So be forgiving, give feedback to the students, ask questions about their vocabulary, word choices, but make sure that we are not overly penalizing them and making them really anxious about putting words they know on the page. Okay, so thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. I think you have questions, so thank you.
We have our second speaker. Thank you very much again, Dr. Karen Alejandra Cruz Bucanda. We are very happy to have you here today and having accepted to be part of this seminar today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much again in the name of all of our students and the staff here at the University Language Department. So Maestra Karen Alejandra Cruz Bucanda has recently obtained her master's degree in applied linguistics in English language teaching by the Universidad de Guanajuato. She studied a bachelor's in English language teaching and has been teaching English for 8 years to middle, high school, and university students. Her areas of interest are intercultural competence, teachers, intercultural competence, culture, non-native English teachers, and native. And welcome in this presentation. Please go ahead. Please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, for having me here. What I'm going to present today is what I did as my research in the master's program. I just recently got my degree, obtained my degree, so finally. So my research is about Latin American English teachers experiences in a North and Southeast Asia context, a narrative inquiry into intercultural teaching competence. As my bio data says, I'm interested in teachers' intercultural competence rather than students' intercultural competence. So what I'm going to talk about today is first, I will talk about my motivation, what led me to decide to research about this topic. Also my research questions, my context, the key concepts that I use in chapter 2 in the literature framework, and also the methodology, the data analysis, and my conclusions after analyzing the information. First of all, my motivation. Well, yeah, we all know that when we start a master's program, sometimes there are so many ideas. When we start a research in general, sometimes we have so many ideas that we don't know where to go, what to choose. Fortunately, I had the experience of working in China. So as an English teacher, that's what like the main thing I wanted to explore, I wanted to work with. And actually the teachers over there introduced me to several theories, to several ideas. And that's how I started building my research. Of course, there were times when this is not how I started at the beginning, but fortunately, it ended up being something that I really liked, and I got to learn more about something that I'm interested in. So that's since I was a Mexican English teacher teaching in China, where students don't speak English, they speak Chinese, and they have variations of Chinese. There are also other languages like Mandarin, because the Mandarin and Cantonese, for some people they are considered like different languages. So in this case, I was really curious what is the work of other teachers working over in those areas, in those contexts. So my research questions were, how do Latin American EFL teachers develop their intercultural teaching competence while working in North and Southeast Asia? Also, how do they integrate the different cultures involved? In this case, we have the Latin American teachers, we have the English cultures, and we have the South and Northeast Asian cultures. So in this case, there's so many cultures involved inside of the classroom, and sometimes we don't realize, even here in Mexico, when we are, for example, in Guanajuato, where the students come from other countries or even from other states, these are big and small cultures that are involved in the classroom, which make the classroom a multicultural classroom. But sometimes we don't pay attention to it. And about the context of the teachers in this case is the Latin American teachers. I will talk about the teachers a little bit when I talk about the participants. And also English as a foreign language, because over there, English is just considered like another subject in the classroom. It's not part of their everyday life. It's not something that you use for like a professional or specific areas in the everyday of the Chinese people or North and Southeast people. Also teaching in North and Southeast Asia. In this case, I use North and Southeast Asia because we have teachers from that not only were teaching in China, but they were teaching in Vietnam or also South Korea. So I'll start by telling you about the key concepts of the research. In this case, we have the multicultural EFL classroom. As I mentioned, even in Mexico, we have a multicultural classroom. So imagine being there with a teacher who is from Latin America and also is teaching another language. And then you have students from China or from Vietnam or from South Korea that maybe are from different parts because they may not be from that city. They may come from other city. So that's why I thought it was important to start with that topic. After that, I speak about world Englishes. In this case, I use Cashu's model, which I'm going to show in a bit. And I talked about identity, how teachers felt because they are in a new place. They are, well, for some of them, it was a new place. For some of them, there were some conceptions about how a teacher should act or must look like, okay? And also the native speakerism, which is a term that kind of establishes how an English teacher should look or should act or should know. So in this case, Holiday came up with this term of native speakerism that is kind of based on what the ideas of an English teacher, how they should look like. And intercultural teaching competence, which is the main topic in the research. In this case, I talk about intercultural competence, first of all, because it didn't start as intercultural competence, but it started as intercultural communicative competence. You can see like Bennett's or Biran's model, which are more based on intercultural communicative competence. And after that, for my research, I decided to select, we can say more recent, but it's from like the 2006, 2000, like it's not that recent anymore. But I decided to follow or base my model and how I analyze data is Deerdorf's model, which I am going to explain as well. So one of the main ideas is word Englishes. In this case, Cashew is telling us how we categorize English based on the use of English in those places. So he divided word Englishes or the use of English in different models, different circles, sorry. The inner circle is the countries that use English as the main language. It may not be the official language, but it's used for their everyday lives. If you go to make like governmental processes, if you are going to go to the supermarket and buy something, English is the main language. And the outer circle, we have these countries where they have English as another, as part of their daily life, but it's not the main language. For example, in India, they use different languages, different languages, and also they use English, and they can be interchanged, but none of those. Maybe Hindu is the main language, maybe their main language or the native language is the main language, but they are able to use English if they want to do something in their context. And when Cashew says the expanded circle, is these countries where English it's starting to be part of. For example, in China, if you go to China, maybe you won't be able to interact with the police officers in English because not everybody speaks English. Or if you go to Vietnam, also, it may be difficult. You may have to find somebody who speaks English so you can receive help. So that's how the expanding circle, that's what the expanding circle presents. The expansion of English in other countries where English is not still, it's there, but it's not one of the main languages. They are given importance to the language, but it's not still like really big, okay? So in order to identify how English is in China, and how to analyze the data, I decided to follow the process model of intercultural competence, as I mentioned before, from Deerdorf. And here, Deerdorf says it's like a cycle. First, you have the attitudes. Then you're going to have the knowledge or the comprehension. Then you have the desired internal outcome, and then the desired external outcome. In the first part, in the attitudes, is how you feel about the culture. All of this is related to the culture since we are talking about intercultural competence. Attitude is related to how we see the culture, how we imagine the culture, what do we know about the culture, like in general, okay? In the knowledge and comprehension is now actually learning about the culture. Because in the attitudes, our knowledge may come from different sources of different ideas, of perceptions. And knowledge and comprehension, in this case, we are more sure about what it is. We actually saw it. We actually learned about it. When we go to desired internal outcomes, in this case is how we adapt ourselves into the culture, how we try to get inside of the culture, how we try to be part of the culture. And the external outcome is now taking that, what I learned from the culture, and use it with the people. So that's how she mentioned that this is a process that takes us in order to become intercultural competent. And this can happen as learners of a language, and sometimes it can go to just moving to another city without knowing the language. You don't need to, it's not necessary, the language, it's part of it, okay? But in this case, the culture is what is the main idea of the process of intercultural competence. So for the methodology, of course, is a qualitative approach, because I wanted to try and learn and also understand, that's a word, understand the teachers' experiences, what happened with them while they were living there. And I was really interested in working with narratives. That's why I decided to follow a narrative inquiry. So they were able to express their stories through these ideas. First, I used questionnaires, which were mainly to obtain the participants' information, because I needed to present them, to let the readers know who the teachers are, where they come from, if they have previous studies, or if they have taught before. So that's why I decided to use the questionnaire. Then I use the narrative frames. These narrative frames, I elaborate them, and it was based on Deardorff's model, but in this case, it was based on my understanding of Deardorff's model, how I make a meaning of Deardorff's model, and that's how I created the frames. I don't know if you have used frames or you know the narrative frames. These are like, do you know narrative frames? No? Okay. Well, narrative frames is like a way to prompt the participants to say what you want to say, what you want them to tell you. You give them like the beginning of a sentence, and they just continue writing. So the main way of doing narrative frames is through writing, but it's just giving the first idea, and then they just have to explain themselves, and they are free to write as much as they want. And then I continue with narrative interviews. These narrative interviews is based on the data collected in the frames. I got some ideas, and then I made like questions, but they were like open questions where they can tell a story, where they can give me a narrative of that specific information. So in this case, since teachers are bilingual, I just let them let them speak or write in the language they prefer. And I noticed that more for the frames, since they started in English, they continued in English. But in the narrative interviews, it was a video call, because they were in those countries at the moment. I decided in that case, they had the ability to speak. Not the ability. They had the ability since they were born, but they were able to speak. They were, and most of them, the ones who participated in the narrative interviews, they felt more comfortable speaking in Spanish. But they were able to code switch just because they were bilingual. So that helped. It helped a lot, and it gave them the freedom of say what they wanted to say in the language they prefer. So based about my instruments, these are the protocols that I created the questionnaire. This is the questionnaire. As you can see, I asked for the name, their email. Of course, I'm still like respecting their anonymity, so I'm not using their real names. Actually, like the time they have been in Asia, previous studies, just to know more about them. And for the narrative frames, those are the prompts that I used. And as I mentioned, they were in English. This is actually one of the difficulties I face, because I ended up creating a lot of frames. And sometimes, as for some people, writing is not like something they feel comfortable with, or we just saw a presentation about writing, right? And the feelings that students or people, even though they speak both languages, sometimes you don't feel comfortable with writing or speaking. So after the questionnaire, I create this chart in order to categorize or in order to put in order the participants. I have Alma, she teaches in Vietnam, Jose in Vietnam as well, Valeria in China, Osvaldo in Vietnam, Kira in Korea, and Esther in China. So you can see that they teach mostly young learners, but some of them also teach adults. Also, they have lived in a foreign language before, in a country where their language was a foreign language. They teach in elementary and also university. I thought of asking them about the reasons to live in a foreign country, because of sometimes in order to go to a country, we need to have an be interested in a country. So most of them say because of work, to volunteer, to develop myself. Actually, in this case, only Valeria has an MA. The other participants have like certifications in the English language, and that was enough. And they had previous knowledge. So that can show us that they did have previous knowledge in teaching English. And after analyzing the data and categorizing the data, I came up with these emerging themes, which were the participants' relationship with local cultures. This is based on my perception of Deirdre's model. I have the perceptions, knowledge, understanding, and interaction. As I mentioned, perception is what we perceive from the culture. The knowledge is what I know about the culture, what I understand, and now I'm living here. Why are they doing this? Why is this happening? It's their culture. And after that, their interaction. Because in most of the schools, it was not like a foreign teachers school, or it was not full of Latin American teachers. They have Chinese teachers, Philippines teacher, from India, from United States, from other parts of Latin America. So it was a multicultural class, and also a context, and also they have different teachers. And some schools in those countries, they look for that. They are called international schools because they have international teachers, so they need to reflect that in the teachers that work with them. After that, I have the expat and teacher identity. This was a term that came up while doing the frames, the expat. And it's something that it was quite like a crucial term, because it's how they see themselves living in that country. Then the use of cultural content in the classroom, school interaction, how they use the cultures involved in the classroom. So for the data analysis, I have relationship with the cultures. For the perception, Kira says that my perception of living in Asia is an extremely conservative place, and people will speak English. When she arrived, people didn't, or she had a lot of problems finding people who spoke English. So in this case, it's perceptions. What do we think about the country? In this case, maybe Kira is from South Korea as the SK. So sometimes, I don't know if you have noticed, but South Korea is like a big thing right now. And you may think that everybody speaks English because they have a lot of contact with the United States and all that. But no, when you go there, it turns out, no, your perception is not real. And also Valeria, she lives in China. It says the people have different way of thinking, of course. Culture was based in respect and traditions. Now that I'm here, I'm sorry, what I understand from the culture is that they have their traditions. Because of what I know of China, what I have seen or what I have read about China, what I have seen about China. Then I have Osvaldo. About the knowledge is I have changed my perception of the local culture because I'm teaching. They have taught me the true nature of being in Vietnam, of the Vietnamese people, of the Vietnamese culture. So now that I'm here, what I actually know, what I actually understand, sorry, is that this is how Vietnamese are. This is the Vietnamese culture. And then in the interaction, Alma says that people are generally very nice. They are smiley, they are eager to help, they are willing to show you their customs. So they really they are quite welcoming in other people from other cultures, from other countries, which make him feel more comfortable staying there. And maybe it had helped in feeling more comfortable interacting. And about identity, I have Valeria. In this case, as I mentioned, this main topic, main concept of expat, there's really common, Valeria mentioned that in other excerpt, that they as foreigners are called expat community. And expat comes from the expatriada, from the word expatriada in Spanish. So in this case, she says, like, I don't identify like that. I know where I come from. I know that I'm from Mexico. So it's not like I left my country and that's not my patria anymore. I still belong to Mexico, and right now my life is here as well, but it's part of me. So in China, in this case, there are these expat groups where not only Latin Americans, but people who are not from there are called this way. So it's like a way to let them know that they are not from here. Okay. Also, Osvaldo says about the teacher identity. Parents want foreign teachers, white-skinned teachers. They don't want their children to look happy in the pictures. They want their children, sorry. Most of them do not even care if their children can hold a conversation in English. So Osvaldo was mentioning that sometimes as a kindergarten teacher, parents only want to see the teacher that looks like the Hollywood look. That he mentioned that at the beginning in one of the answers, because how people in Hollywood movies look like. Can you tell me? White. What else? Blue eyes, tall, slim, blonde as well, right? So handsome or beautiful, they have. Okay, so in order to be hired by a school, even though you were from Latin America, and we know that Latin America have different like complexion, like different how they look like, it's completely different because there is a mixture of many cultures, many like races, a lot. So if you wanted to go there and teach, you have to look like people in Hollywood movies. So imagine going there, and if you don't have blue eyes, you cannot get a job. Or you go there, and if you're blonde, you are not like appropriate. So he was like that was something that was really difficult for them to know that their identity, or them working as a teacher, having the opportunity to work as a teacher, had to do also with how they look like. Even if they studied a lot, even if they had a master's, or if they had TEFL certificates, how they look is why they were going to get hired. So after that, analyzing the information about how they use the cultural content. In this case, Jose said that my own culture, I use my own culture, like Jose is from Colombia, to teach when I wanted my students to see where I come from. So in order to let your students know about you, they use their own culture as well. Because if some of them didn't even know where Colombia was or where Mexico was, so it's important for them to show them that it's not like this. And for example, it's it's really amazing how you can show for Coco movie and they're like, ah, yeah, from United States. And then you say, no, it's not from United States. It's from Mexico. Mexico? But isn't it Mexico in United States? It's not. Kind of very close to each other. So, also, Alma says, pues siempre ahí es cuando saco las similitudes, cuando ya no conocen. Entonces, y como México está tan lejos de lo que ellos saben, y empiezas you start like introducing a country that they may not know, and that's how you start getting their interest. And then you show them that it's maybe more known than they think, and maybe they use things, or maybe they know about the movie, about music, about singers, and they are like, oh, and the teacher told us about Mexico. And then also Alma says that English speaking culture, I always try to integrate English speaking culture in my lessons. Learning the culture is part of learning a language. So we don't, as English teachers, we always know that English and culture are together. And in this case, we need to, in the case of Alma, she always used the English culture, so the students know where the language is from or what language they are learning, okay? So it's part of it. So in this case, you can use your own culture, you can use the students' culture, you can use the language culture because they are together, and also you bring a sense of belonging when you use a student's culture, and also students get to feel more connected with you because you tell them about your culture. So it's like a mixture of many cultures. And that doesn't mean that it has to be like confusing for students. It's just like letting them know that there are differences, there are other cultures in the world, even inside of English. So based on this data I analyzed, my conclusions were like the participants mostly agreed that language and culture are intrinsically linked together. This is like a kind of a rule in language learning and teaching. Like we know that they are together. And even, so maybe if you're teaching the language, you don't notice, but even when you're explaining vocabulary or where the vocabulary comes from, even when you're explaining how we use something in social interactions, you are explaining culture. You are using the culture of the language. And sometimes you can even use the culture, your own culture, to explain, this is not what we do in the other language, okay? Also, for the same reason, they prefer to use different Englishes, which include several native speaker varieties beyond the usual suspects, as well as non-native Englishes. So usual suspects is the cultures that we most of the time decide to teach in the classroom. Do you teach? Yes? Okay. When you started teaching, what culture were you teaching? American, right? From United States. Why?
It's closer to us.
It's closer? Okay.
I think British or Australian.
Okay. I was taught the same. Like I have to teach it because I'm from Sonora. So Arizona is there. And when I was teaching, they were like, but they mostly going to go to Tucson or Phoenix to go shopping every weekend. So you should teach them American English or culture of like United States English. And I was like, okay, yes, let's do it. But now that I'm here, it's like, why can I not teach them that there's not only Canada, United States, and UK? Why can I not teach them that there is African like cultures there, and they have English as one of the languages. There are even like Fiji Islands. English is one of their languages. And do you know where Fiji Islands are? Kind of, but like very small, like under Indonesia, something like that. So they also have English as one of the languages. Australia is another one, but also other countries like Indonesia is one of the outer external circles. They also use English as part of their everyday, not as mainly as the languages over there, but they are also part of the English speaking culture. So we have to be more open in in which English culture we teach. It's not only being specific, and this is the one because they are going to be it's closer to them. And what about like technology right now? They have exposure to all types of culture. If you listen to Troye Sivan, he's from UK. But if you listen to Gideon, I don't know if you know, he's like a jazz singer. He's from United States, but his roots are from Africa. So why, if they listen to him, why don't you teach English from other places? So let's try to be a little bit more open. It's not like pulling all the cultures and let them know about everything. It's just bringing the cultures as an example and bringing interaction is in other areas. It may be a little bit more work for teachers, but it's worth it. And because you don't only create intercultural stuff, you don't only help students to create their intercultural competence, but you also make them more tolerant in other cultures and let them know that there are different ways to do something, because English doesn't belong to one country. Also, participants commented that they were supposed to live up to expectations of the Hollywood look, since media representations of English speakers create certain expectations. So in this case, most people know about the culture, English-speaking cultures, because of the movies, because of TV. And which countries are in that area mainly? USA, UK. So it's, again, we just put them in one type of culture, and we don't let them know that there are varieties, not only in languages, in culture, but also in race, okay? Also, intercultural competent teachers identify the importance of other cultures and intend to implement the cultures surrounding their classroom for other students' language learning. In this case, we reflect the intercultural competence that we want the students to learn. If we remember that maybe the first approach students have to a culture is the English teacher or the language teacher they have in the classroom. So if we can create perceptions in students. So if we just start telling students, no eres estadounidense si no tienes los ojos azules. No, es que en Estados Unidos solamente se puede hablar de esta manera. No, es que si estás en el sur de Estados Unidos tienes que hablar como el hood, y si estás en el norte tienes que hablar así. Y es que si vas no sé, a África, no puedes hablar así. Those ideas may have more impact than we think. So in order to be able to actually help students with their intercultural competence, teachers may have some as well, may have developed theirs as well. So this will be it. I hope I didn't make you sleepy. So thank you very much. This is my email if you ever want to contact me for like a question or an idea. It's more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I agree totally with you in that this is a very important topic these days, especially because we know that there are lots of people migrating from different parts in the world, in Europe, in South America to North America. So knowledge about multicultural competence is very important to avoid many communicative issues that may emerge this migration. So thank you very much for such an important topic. So Melanie, are you here? Okay. So I think that it's time to ask some questions from you to the guest speakers. So did you write your questions or you have them in your ribbon? So please ask them. They are here for you to answer or clarify anything you have, or if you have comments as well, those are also welcome. So, volunteers? Over there, yes, please.
You mentioned about. Good afternoon, everyone. About each culture, let's say all the parts of the planet. Which part do you like to teach in the future, as not counting USA or UK from other parts that English is the first or second language?
Like for me as a teacher, where do I want to go and teach? Okay, well, I would like to continue teaching in Asia because for me it's something that I like. So I think that it helped me also in using their culture, but I also use culture. I teach in the general courses, so I also use the students' culture. And some of they are from here, from Mexico, and even though some of them are from Salamanca, Irapuato, I have a student from Torreon, and and I even since we're from the north of Mexico, sometimes I use our examples in order to teach the culture, or like for example, in the north we do this, and here in the south that's not really good, but when we speak English it may work, or maybe people in the United States may do it this way. So it's just like putting examples. You're welcome. I know if I answered it.
Yeah.
First one. What was like one of the biggest challenge for you to do narrative inquiry?
It was a lot of information. When I went to the interviews, like I said that the frames were really short. First, there was not enough information, and then there was too much information. But for example, not all the participants wanted to continue with the interview, so it decreased. But still, I did have a lot. But I think that you really need to like the methodology, because if you struggle, is at least I like it. At least I like it. It's like what makes you think. But if you like stories, you may like it. But because it's a lot of information, and you have to be really careful that you are actually taking the information you need for your data, or that actually helps you answer your questions. You may go like different ways.
Thank you. Another question? Over there. What, based on your experience, what help you to using vocabulary, help you to do better academic writing?
Good question. So I think some of the ways to do better with academic writing is to give yourself time and say the first draft is not going to be the final draft. And one thing that actually helps me, remember I said try to use multiple languages, whether that's, like Spanish and English, or 2 varieties of English to do it. One of the things I started to do when I had to become a professor and I had to do research and I had to publish papers, I would actually record myself talking about it, and then you would have a transcript, and then that made it a lot easier to just get my ideas out, because if you talk it out, it's okay to be messy, it's okay to use different words. And then I would go back to the transcript and I would clean it up and make it look beautiful. I'd look at the journal's requirements for what to do, and so I would then change my vocabulary, pick different words, synonyms, things like that, to make it more academic sounding. So I would use the power of my oral language skills to help my writing. Because it was if I stared at a blank document or a blank piece of paper and I just wanted to write, I could sit there for 30 minutes and then I'd be like, what's happening on Instagram? Or let's check, so talking it out really, really helped me. And it showed the power of just, using multiple varieties in different languages in order to get out your ideas. And I worked for students too.
So, okay, over there, Karen. How would you give feedback to students on the found writing? Because sometimes classmates don't understand the feedback that the teachers give us, and it's motivated by that.
Great.
So my trick, because I teach writing and and at multiple levels to multilingual students, to my graduate students that have to do research. So what I do is I give feedback throughout the entire writing process instead of leaving it all the way to the end. So for example, I ask my students to, just brainstorm, just for 5 minutes, write what you know about the topic, and then exchange that with a partner, have a partner give feedback. I would walk around the room and I would give little comments. If it's a longer piece of writing, I would actually give feedback on multiple drafts. And then by the time it came to the final draft, I have already given them like informal, we talked about it. Other students gave feedback on that process. So by the end, the time it came to grading, actually was way easier because I already knew what they were kind of saying. We've already made comments on vocabulary, grammar, how to structure the ideas. So my grading time was a lot faster at the end because I was already quite familiar with what the students were saying. And I think that made the students feel less pressure because they knew I wasn't grading them in those previous drafts. I was just there to check in and answer questions and tell them ideas, things like that. So it was a lifesaver for my grading. It would go a lot faster if you do it throughout the semester rather than yes. And if you do that, honestly, like when you give feedback on the very final paper and you hand it back to the students, what do the students do with that paper? They're like, yeah, okay, it's already graded. I'm not going to make changes to it. It's on to the next topic because I have the next assignment to turn in.
Especially because the revenue learning process.
Yes.
It's something that you have to just one CV. It's a process that it should develop through time. Okay, another question? Okay, Megan,
but now that you mentioned the levels, do you consider that there is a specific level to start working with academic writing?
Like proficiency level? No, not really, because academic writing, kind of talking about different varieties of language and expectations. Academic writing can be almost anything. If you think about young children, academic writing in elementary context can be storytelling, to create a story, things like that. All the way up as they get older, they might start doing summaries or analysis or persuasive type writing. So academic writing can be broadly defined as classroom writing. And in that case, actually, it's never too early to start showing students the examples between academic and social language. You'll be amazed that even young children can recognize that, oh, I should do something differently if it's considered academic and someone else is looking at it for a grade. So it's always helpful for students to become aware of the social practices of language and what it means to use certain words with different things. Because young kids, even from their parents, are going to have an idea in their first language what kinds to use. No, don't use that word. That's a bad word. So there's the concept is there at any proficiency level, any age level.
okay.
Yes. What did you download to add subtitles to your presentation?
That's a scaffold I use all the time because I know sometimes I can speak fast and I work with multilingual students all the time, and also sometimes hearing impaired. So Microsoft PowerPoint, the newer Office 365, has a setting that you can go to and do auto transcription, and it will automatically transcribe your voice in multiple languages. You can even set it to Spanish and it will do it in Spanish, but it's not perfect. Yes. And as we talked about, like usage and frequency, it might pull some odd words, but it's better than no.
Okay. Thank you. One more over there.
It was in regards to one of the points in the presentation that said that we have to select a variety of words and count them. So I was really curious to know what would be some techniques to do.
Sure. For selecting a variety of words, I recommend, especially when teaching writing, don't always pick those low frequency terms like hypothesis and parlance and all these fancy words. That's the tendency of a lot of teachers to do. But as I mentioned, for writing, those high frequency words, when you start putting them together, is oftentimes a very sophisticated difference between social English and academic English. So even if students have already learned those words, focus on those and focus how they're used with other words around it. You might see the word take put with away, and in one word, take away actually means conclusion in this sentence. So even though students might know take and away, put it together, that's a whole nother idea. So vary the types of words you're picking. For tracking the words, I've seen a lot of practice here in Mexico. The students keep notebooks, and that's like part of the classroom practice. You can have students set up vocabulary notebooks where they write down as you pre-teach these new words and phrases to them and how they're used in the notebook. Or if you have a dedicated classroom space, you can create a word wall where in a unit of instruction, you just write all the words they learn, and then as they sit down to write, remind them, hey, look at all the words we were practicing. I want you to use 5 of those new words in your essay for this class. And as I mentioned, hold them accountable. Say, oh, you know what? I think one of those words can work in your essay. Try to use it here, and have them start trying to practice with those new words. So vocabulary notebooks, word walls, those are really 2 old but good strategies. Flashcards, things like that can help track students' vocabulary usage.
Thank you very much. Patty, you have a question?
I have a very quick question to Karen. About your research. What was the most surprising data that you collected? Something you did not expect in your research?
That expat term. That was something new because I was not considering. Actually, when I was living there, I was part of the expat community. I was even in in China, they don't use like WhatsApp or something like that. They use WeChat. And I was in a group called the expat community, but I didn't know that why? Like I never thought about it. And when Valeria and Osvaldo also mentioned it, I was like, expat, but what they mean by that, like what is it about? And then I started to notice how, for example, in United States they call Mexican immigrants when they are not immigrants. Also, they immigrate, but in this case, for example, Mexicans could be expats because expats is like the community that has an economic like weight, like it's heavy in the area. Tiene un peso económico en el país. Entonces, Mexicans can be called expat, but when US citizens come to Mexico, then if you call them immigrants, because at the end of it all, they actually immigrate to Mexico, they're like, no, we are expats. So it's like the way, how you see the term and why is immigrant so belittled and why expat it's better for me. Even though US citizens are also expats in Mexico because they do provide a lot to Mexican economy, but that was a term that it was new. I learned about it. It's not like the socio-economical meaning, but it also has like an identity meaning.
Students from the DA. So my question will be, do you think we need to make our students more aware of the multiculturality of other classrooms? And how do you suggest we can help them or our future teachers to do so? Because in my experience, I've been checking that here in our context, we really don't have that experience for multiculturality at classrooms. But when you go outside, you get shock culture that, oh my gosh, there's different ways of teaching, of classrooms, and so on. So I think your research is very interesting. So how do you suggest we can help them to do so?
Oh, well, One of the activities that came up with this research was like a teacher workshop in order to create intercultural competent activities in order to present the culture of the language. I was able to teach or give this workshop to the language teachers, only the English area, and I focus on Deerdorf's model as well. So in this case, I think that teachers need to be intercultural competent in order to, as you said, be aware of the multiculturality that is around us, and that those teachers can then go to their students and maybe use not only Deerdorf, but there are other models like Virams or other researchers that are working with intercultural communicative competence, and you can give workshops to students who will become teachers. So I think that it's part of what the examples we use in the classroom and what we teach them or what we tell them, not to put them only in a box and tell them you are going to teach English culture from America because that's the closest to students. So I think that it will begin with the teacher who's teaching the BA students and how we can teach them how to create activities that involve other cultures. Also, to be aware of other cultures inside of their own country, on their own context. So it's just creating awareness of the students who will become language teachers. I will see it that way. You need to be prepared, and you have to give that to the students you're teaching, it's like passing the language from one generation to another, or from one teacher to another teacher who will teach other students. So I will see it that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Karen. I know that maybe you have many more questions, but I can tell you that we will have some coffee and some biscuits outside. If you have more questions, maybe you have the chance to ask them directly outside, because it's almost time to close this session. So I just want to appreciate so much to you for being here today and sharing with all of us your knowledge and your experience in these topics that you have presented. And I would like to say as well that we will be sending you the certificates of participation through email to you tomorrow. And thank you very much again for being here. And I invite you just to come here with all of us to have some coffee and some biscuits for you as well. So thank you very much. And Patty, I think that she will say the closure words. Thank you for you all.
Just thank everybody. Thanks, Graciela. Thanks to our wonderful presenters.
Yes, just a final notice. I have to invite you as well. Next week we will have other sessions. I hope that you attend them. Most of them will be here. So please come, and you will be welcome again, and you will be given also some certificates of participation.
I'll
share the posters with you through email, but also I have here the code so that you, in case that you are at home, can also enter through the Zoom. Okay, but I suggest that you come. It's better to be here, being in touch with the speakers and directly ask. Thank you very much again. And